On the 7th of June 1951, a savage war criminal who was responsible for the slaughter of thousands of people made his way to the gallows inside of an American-occupied prison. He was helped up the stairs of the execution structure and was then handed over to the executioner, who secured the noose around his neck, and looking pensive, he was shuffled over the trapdoor. Erich Naumann was one of many horrific beasts who would during the Second World War be responsible for the Einsatzgruppe, the paramilitary death squads and groups of executioners who would follow the advances of the German army and would slaughter hundreds of thousands of civilians. He tried to suggest that he was a man who was simply following the orders given to him by a superior officer, but this was rejected, and because of this he was executed on the gallows inside of Landsberg Prison. Join us today as we look at the execution of the brutal Einsatzgruppe commander, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Erich Naumann was born on the 29th of April 1905 inside of Meissen in Saxony. It is presumed he had a rather normal upbringing, but his family would never have believed the brute he would become during the Second World War. When he was 16, Naumann left school, and he took a job inside of a local firm in his hometown. But at the end of the 1920s, Naumann, like thousands of other German people, would be lured in and attracted to the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. He was at the time in his mid-20s, and it would be within the Nazi organisations that later came to power and prominence in Germany that Naumann would go from a simple sales job to becoming a man who was in charge of death squads and executioners. In 1933 he joined the SA, the Brown Shirts, or the Stormtroopers as they were known. The SA were considered the bodyguards of Adolf Hitler. They would often disrupt the meetings of political rivals and fight on the streets with those people the Nazis would persecute. They also attacked rival political parties and would cause chaos and disruption. Naumann was a member of these thuggish men, but at some point Hitler had become to get convinced that the SA were being too powerful. Some of his inner circle had played on his anxieties that he could be usurped by his friend the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, as many in the SA were more loyal to Rome than Hitler. But Hitler would order the Night of the Long Knives, a huge purge of the Brown Shirts, which resulted in many deaths and executions and large-scale arrests. Naumann survived this purge, and he, despite being a full-time member of the SA, had become an officer of the police and was a rather senior official in the group. But in 1935 he was moved across to the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. This was the intelligence service of the SD, and Naumann was in a role in which he was now responsible for gathering information about the enemies of the Nazis, or those suspected of dissenting. They worked alongside the Gestapo and others, and the SD were brutal in their work. They would hunt down those who were being persecuted by the Nazis. He continued in this role for a number of years, and further promotions came for him inside of the SS, as he eventually rose to the rank of SS Brigadeführer. But his most horrific actions came during the Second World War, and specifically inside of lands that had been taken and seized by the German army. The Einsatzgruppe were the paramilitary death squad set up by the SS, and the Nazis would carry out the slaughter of millions of civilians, following advancements which were made by the Wehrmacht. After the German army pushed on, these executioners arrived, and they came to settlements all over occupied lands, and would sort the civilian population. They then led people to the edge of the settlements, where they forced them at gunpoint to dig a huge pit, and this would become their graves. In smaller groups all day long, and sometimes for many days, groups of civilians would be led into the pits. They would either be shot by the Einsatzgruppe executioners, who were stood on the edge of the pit, armed with their rifles. They could also be told to lie down on the corpses of those who went before. They would then be shot in the back of the head. It was mass slaughter on a huge scale. Erich Naumann was seen as a trusted member of the SS, and as soon as the Second World War broke out in Europe with the German invasion of Poland, Naumann was given command of the Einsatzgruppe 6. During the Polish campaign, his execution squad slaughtered over 6,000 people. His actions had led to the mass murder of members of the Polish elite, and many of these victims were former teachers, members of the clergy, actors, former officers, members of the intelligentsia, and activists. But this would just be the start of Erich Naumann's horrific work, as following his work in Poland he was made the chief of Einsatzgruppe B from November 1941 and he remained in this job until around March 1943. He was now overseeing more detachments of executioners and much more slaughter of civilians. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppe went into overdrive, slaughtering hundreds of thousands, and Naumann reported to Adolf Eichmann in November 1941 that his men had been responsible for the deaths of 17,256 people in Smolensk. His Einsatzgruppe would mostly use gunshot to execute, but they also had other weapons at their disposal, and they used free gas vans to slaughter. In his own words, he used these to exterminate human beings, but the continued massacres led to further reports in which Naumann claimed that by December 1942, his men had executed 134,298 people. He was a man who would coordinate the massacres, and he was there witnessing it a lot of the time. He was not sat behind a desk thousands of miles away. He was often commanding the soldiers and telling them to shoot. The SS and Eichmann, along with Heinrich Himmler, were impressed by Naumann's ruthless work and his evil, and he was rewarded in September 1943 and was made the commander of the security police and SD in the occupied Netherlands. He would continue to be brutal in this role and kept up with executions and torture and used death squads to strike fear into the hearts of the Dutch people. But as the war turned against the Germans, there was a scramble by members of the SS and high-ranking members to try and save their own skin. Men like Erich Naumann knew that if they were caught, they would be tried by Allied nations for their horrific crimes, and Heinrich Himmler advised his top men to obtain false papers and false identities to try and live discreetly without detection. However, Erich Naumann was captured by the Allies, and his crimes would be told about to his interrogators, and with this he was brought to trial alongside many other high-ranking members of the Einsatzgruppe. Surprisingly, the Allies managed to have in their custody a large number of those men who coordinated the mass slaughter. It was said in the judgment that, in this case, the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killing through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds and thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field, actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking an active part in the bloody harvest. The men on trial were accused of murdering over 1 million people, and Erich Naumann would claim at his trial that he did not consider his work and actions when he commanded the Einsatzgruppe to be wrong. He brazenly claimed that he was doing what he believed was sickeningly right for the Nazis, and specifically when asked if he perceived his work and Hitler's orders as being morally wrong, he claimed, "No, Your Honour, I consider the decree to be right, because it was our aim in our part of the war, therefore it was necessary." He claimed that he had been assigned to do a job of executing civilians en masse during the war, and he said he had no problems with doing this. He was asked by the courtroom for further information, and they said, "Then the tribunal will accept from your answer that you saw nothing wrong with your orders, and with the orders, even though it did involve the killing of defenceless human beings. This is what we draw from your answer." Erich Naumann just nodded to this and replied, "Yes, Your Honour." He accepted his work and was not guilty about the fact he is considered to have been responsible for the slaughter of at least 95,000 confirmed victims, and many dozens of thousands more. For his role in the Second World War in the SS, Erich Naumann was found guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership of an illegal criminal organisation, the SD and the SS. He was sentenced to death and would be sent to Landsberg Prison to await his execution, and he remained on death row for around 3 years. On the 7th of June 1951, shortly after midnight, Erich Naumann was told it was his time for his execution, and he left his prison cell accompanied by a number of American military policemen and a priest. He was led out into the courtyard of Landsberg Prison, and there stood a large gallows. Naumann was led up the execution scaffold, and he was helped up the stairs, and his arms had been secured behind him by the executioner's assistant. When on top of the steps, the priest asked him for any final words, and he stepped back and let the executioner do his work. The executioner checked Naumann's arms and legs that they were secure, then shuffled him over the trapdoor, and a photograph was taken of him, looking rather pensive and also terrified, as he knew his death was coming. He then had a black cap placed over his head, and the executioner secured the noose, which was hung from the crossbeam. After final checks, the trapdoor was released, and instantly Erich Naumann was executed. He was one of the most despicable war criminals of the Second World War, and Erich Naumann had no remorse for the evil he had committed under the Nazis and the SS. He was a man who deemed his work to have been necessary, and he did not offer any apology or feeling of guilt for the slaughter he was part of, and he witnessed every single day. At the age of 46, the evil of Erich Naumann came to an end inside the walls of Landsberg Prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.